You know what the Nazis did. Almost nobody is taught what Japan did. In 1931, Japan took Manchuria. What they built there is still a stain on all of us. There is a sentence we say every time: nothing could be worse than this. Surely nothing in history was darker. It's worth asking how much we know when we say it, because the honest answer is uncomfortable. Stories like this are not rare. History is full of them, which means we are astonished over and over by something that never stopped happening. I'm Adrian Blackwood. This is Crimes Unplugged. That leaves two possibilities, and I'm not sure which is worse. Either we go on being shocked forever, or one day we stop. Tonight's story comes out of a Japan with very little in common with the country you know now. Occupying, authoritarian, and in the part we're going to look at, without a floor. It's about experiments performed by human beings on other human beings. And about the man who ran them, whose ending is stranger than anything he did. I'm not going to tell you it's the worst thing in history. You just heard me say, I don't trust that sentence. You can decide. Some of what follows is difficult to hear. Viewer discretion is advised. 20 kilometers south of Harbin, in occupied Manchuria, there was a compound, 76 major buildings according to the Japanese blueprint, laboratories, barracks, a power station, its own rail siding, its own airfield. From 1938, the Army declared the ground around it a restricted zone. Nothing overhead and no Chinese building tall enough to see in. It had a name designed to be boring: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. And it had chimneys. Villagers nearby, interviewed decades later, remembered the smoke. What the Japanese told them the place was a lumber mill. Remember that. It comes back, because there was no timber inside those walls. No epidemic prevention either. What was inside was a factory, and what it manufactured was disease. Tested on people at scale, on a schedule for 8 years. The man who built it was an army doctor named Shiro Ishii. Born 1892, trained at Kyoto Imperial University, and by every surviving account, brilliant and almost impossible to work with. In 1928, he left Japan on a 2-year study tour of European laboratories. He later told American interrogators he'd toured the United States and Canada as well. He hadn't. Hold on to that. Knowing how to price himself is the skill that saves his life at the end of this story. He came home in 1930 and started lobbying. His argument wasn't that biological weapons were terrible, it was that they worked, and he proved it using his opponent's own conduct. In 1925, the major powers had signed an agreement at Geneva banning bacteriological weapons in war. Ishii turned it upside down. Nobody outlaws a weapon that doesn't function. The ban wasn't a moral judgment. It was a confession, and those same powers, he told his superiors, were building them in secret anyway. He also had something to show. Ishii had designed a water purification filter, and it was genuinely good. Adopted across the Japanese army, it kept a great many Japanese soldiers from dying of dysentery. That's the part people forget. The man who built what's coming is the same man whose invention stopped his own soldiers dying of dirty water. The filter bought him credibility. Everything else was built on top of it. What he still needed was somewhere with no witnesses. In September 1931, a bomb went off on the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. It was set by Japanese officers, blamed on Chinese soldiers, and used as the pretext for an invasion already prepared. Within months, Japan held Manchuria and installed a puppet state to run it. Now there was territory where Japanese officers answered to nobody local, and a population with no rights at all. Ishii's first site was a walled compound at Beiyinhe. In 1934, a prisoner overpowered a guard, took the keys, and let around 40 people out into the dark. Most were killed or recaptured. Perhaps 16 got clear. 16 people who'd been inside, loose in the world, able to describe it. That site closed, and when the replacement was designed, the prison didn't sit against an outer wall, where one barrier is all that stands between a man and open country. It sat in the middle of a hollow square, the laboratory building wrapped completely around a courtyard with the cells inside it. To reach the outside, you'd first have to escape a building that had no outside. And none of it was off the books. On the 30th of May, 1936, the unit was brought into existence by a formal army order. It had a number, it had a budget line. It was funded and inspected like any other formation because that's what it was. Inside the compound, the prisoners weren't called prisoners. As Hal Gold records in Unit 731 testimony, they were known only as Maruta number so-and-so, and counted, in his phrase, not as one person, two persons, but as one log, two logs. Maruta, logs. The cover story told to the local Chinese, remember, was a lumber mill. The staff made a joke of it. The joke stuck because it was useful. You cannot run a place like this on hatred. Hatred is exhausting and inconsistent, and this ran to a timetable for years. What it runs on is a word. Give a man a category that isn't human, and he never has to make the decision again. It was made upstream in the vocabulary by somebody else. A technician could write that word on a chart and go and eat lunch. They arrive through a paperwork channel with a bureaucratic name that translates as special transfer. Chinese civilians accused of resistance. Korean, Mongolian, and Soviet prisoners. People the military police wanted gone. 277 are named in the files that survive, released from Chinese archives in 1999 and 2014 in ink in a filing system. Farmers, railway workers, people stopped at a checkpoint. And those chimneys, the lumber mill that never cut a single log. You already know what was being burned. I'm going to tell you what was done. I'm not going to crow you. There's no photograph of these procedures anyone can authenticate, and a reconstruction with actors would be the only part of this episode anybody could honestly attack. So, words. You'll do the rest, more accurately than footage would. The core of it was infection. Prisoners were deliberately given plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, glanders, by injection, by contaminated food, or by exposure to plague fleas bred for the purpose, in enormous numbers. Then they were charted and timed, and at a moment chosen by the researcher, not by the disease, the observation was completed by dissection. They were alive when that happened, often with no anesthetic. That's established twice over by evidence that doesn't depend on itself. Sworn testimony at a war crimes trial in 1949. And then, 40 years later, elderly Japanese men giving interviews and testifying in Japanese courtrooms about their own hands. One described a gag pushed into the mouth to stop the screaming. Think about what that proves. You do not gag a man who is unconscious. In winter, there was other work. The Army had a real problem with frostbite and wanted to know how the tissue behaved. So prisoners were held outside below -20, arms bare, frozen under measurement, then thawed by different methods to find which method saved the limb. At an open proving ground, people were tied to stakes at measured distances, and a bomb was set off, and the infections that followed were recorded to the end. Women held there were deliberately infected with syphilis. That was sworn to at the 1949 trial. There's also testimony describing pregnant prisoners and the infection of the unborn. And I'll mark that one because it rests on a few witnesses and no document. The parts of this that sit on paper are strong enough that I don't need to inflate the rest. None of it was research for its own sake. It was a weapons program, and it was used. Start with one object because it settles the question of intent. They built a bomb out of porcelain, not steel, ceramic with a small charge, and a fuse set to open it low. The reason is simple. The payload was fleas and they had to arrive alive. A steel bomb needs a charge big enough to fragment steel, and that charge cooks the fleas. Nobody builds a weapon optimized to deliver living insects to the ground unless the ground is somewhere people live. On the 27th of October, 1940, an aircraft flew over the Chinese city of Ningbo and released wheat, cotton wadding, and fleas over a downtown district. 3 days later, people began dying. 8 days after the drop, the city declared plague, walled the quarter off, and dug a trench around it. And on the evening of the 30th of November, having decided quarantine wouldn't hold, Ningbo burned that district down. Its own district, 11 fires, set at once, 4 hours, about 137 buildings. Around 112 died in the immediate outbreak. A Japanese officer's own post-war arithmetic put it at over 1,500. Both are in the record, counting different things, and I'd rather hand you both than pick the worst one. Ningbo wasn't alone. Chengdu in 1941. Chuzhou, where the epidemic seeded itself into the countryside and kept killing for years after the plane had gone. Wells poisoned, contaminated food handed out. Then in 1942, the Army ran a scorched earth campaign through Zhejiang and Jiangxi, using these agents as it advanced, and advanced into its own contamination. By their own count, roughly 10,000 Japanese soldiers were infected. Around 1,700 died. A pathogen cannot tell one uniform from another. Here's the part that unsettles me most, and the reason this isn't really a story about a monster. The people doing this weren't, on the whole, sadists. They were doctors, surgeons, research physiologists, men with university positions who understood the work as patriotism or as a career. And the proof isn't testimony, it's what they did afterwards. The physiologist who ran the frostbite research published his findings in 1950 and 1952 in English in a peer-reviewed journal under his own name. Technical, dry, exactly what a physiology paper looks like. The subjects are described as laboratory workers, students, soldiers, and laborers. but the data tables are less careful than the description. Among the figures, there are children. In one of them, an infant 3 days old. There's no version of a lawful research program in which a scientist obtains cold immersion measurements from a 3-day-old baby. That isn't a confession. It's better than a confession. It's a man who didn't believe he had anything to confess, filing his results in the ordinary way, because by then the ordinary scientific record had agreed to take them. He became president of a medical university. He was decorated by the state. Those papers were never retracted. They're still cited today. Years later, one of the men who worked there put it as plainly as it can be put. At the time, he said, we believed we were serving the emperor. Afterwards, he understood they'd been serving one man's ambition. In August 1945, the Soviets crossed the border and Ishii gave the order to destroy everything. The buildings were dynamited, papers burned, the prisoners still alive inside the square were killed. The number is disputed, and nobody who could settle it survived. But not everything burned, and this is the hinge of the whole story. Ishii went home carrying the results, slides, specimens, reports. He destroyed the evidence of how the data was obtained and kept the data, because he'd already worked out what it was going to be worth to somebody. His family staged a funeral for him in his home village. It didn't hold. The Soviets caught a number of his people, and in December 1949 at Khabarovsk, 12 men, including the last commander of the Kwantung Army, stood trial in public and described the program in detail. Plague bombs, field trials, vivisection. They were convicted. The longest sentence was 25 years. Nobody was executed. And in the West, the whole thing was dismissed as communist propaganda, which brings us to the part I want to be exact about, because it gets told carelessly, and carelessly is how it gets dismissed. American investigators found Ishii within months. 4 of them came across 2 years. By the third, in 1947, he'd stopped being evasive and started negotiating. And he asked for something specific: immunity from war crimes prosecution in writing. It wasn't America that decided this. It was a fight inside a government. Military intelligence in occupied Tokyo pushed hardest. The Cold War was starting, and the fear was that the Soviets would get the material first. The State Department objected on the record, and its objection is in the files. The decision went to an interagency committee in Washington, Intelligence One. That December, 2 American scientists filed the assessment. 76 interviews, 8,000 pathological slides taken from human beings, and evaluation in their own words. The material had been obtained at the expenditure of many millions of dollars and years of work, and could not have been obtained in American laboratories, because of the scruples attached to human experimentation. The scruples, their word. What was paid was small and shabby. Cash, food, gifts, hotel bills, itemized in 2 memoranda that summer. The intelligence chief who signed them called it a pittance. While Nuremberg was prosecuting German doctors for exactly this, the tribunal in Tokyo never prosecuted the Japanese program at all. One of its judges wrote afterwards that he hadn't been told it existed. And there's another half to this, which matters. You know all of it because of Americans. A U.S. journalist put it in print in 1981. A congressional hearing took evidence in 1986. An American disclosure law in 1999 forced the files open, which is why the reports I just quoted can be read today by anyone in the National Archives. Made in secret by a handful of officials, broken open in daylight by people from the same country. Ishii was never charged, not by anyone. He went home, lived out his life in Japan, and in 1959 died of throat cancer in a Tokyo hospital at 67. His funeral committee was chaired by the officer who had commanded Unit 731 for most of the war, sent home in 1946 without charge, and later the head of a major Japanese pharmaceutical company. Total convictions in a Japanese or an American court for any of this, 0. Then came the quiet. For decades, Unit 731 was missing from Japanese textbooks. One historian spent 30 years in the court, fighting the ministry that kept cutting it out of his. Politicians didn't raise it. Survivors weren't asked. It broke in the 1980s when a Japanese writer published a book that forced the argument into the open. I should tell you the follow-up volume ran into trouble. A number of its photographs turned out to come from an unrelated plague epidemic 30 years earlier, and it was withdrawn and reissued. The facts survived it. But people who want this history disbelieved have pointed at those pictures ever since, which is exactly why this episode leans on documents. And it's still coming out. In 2018, Japan's own National Archives released the unit's personnel roster, 3,607 names. The people it was done to got none of that. No trial. No statement, no chance to say who they were. Most were never given a grave. They went into the furnaces and their names went with them. In the records, they were a number attached to a word that meant timber. In 1997, a group of Chinese plaintiffs sued the Japanese government. In 2002, a Tokyo court found, as a matter of fact, that Japan had waged germ warfare against Chinese civilians. Then it dismissed the claim for compensation. Higher courts agreed. The finding stands. The redress doesn't. There's a museum on the site now. You can walk it. The foundations of the incinerators are still in the ground. And the numbers, at the end, where they belong. Inside the compound, at least 3,000 dead. That's a historian's floor, not a total. Across the whole network of units, Sheldon Harris put it at 10 to 12,000. In the cities, the estimates run from tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands, and I'm not going to resolve that for you. The spread isn't a failure of history, it's part of the crime. They burn the arithmetic on the way out. The museum has confirmed just under 3,000 names of the dead. The staff roster runs to 3,607. We know in more detail who was in that building than who was taken into it. This isn't only a story about wartime cruelty. It's a story about what science becomes when you take the ethics out, which isn't slower science or smaller science. It's a different thing, wearing the same coat. Progress without a conscience isn't progress. It's damage with a method. And the reason to keep saying this number and this address outside Harbin is the thing I started with. There's a version of us that stops being shocked. Everyone who signed one of those transfer forms had already got there. Remembering isn't sentiment. It's the opposite of what they were counting on. That's where we'll leave it tonight. I'm Adrian Blackwood. Thank you for watching Crimes Unplugged.